Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video discusses the sociological, historical, and statistical trends surrounding divorce in the United States. The information provided is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws vary significantly by state, and individual outcomes are influenced by a wide array of personal and jurisdictional factors. You should conduct your own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals, such as attorneys or financial planners, regarding your specific situation. In the next 10 minutes, a marriage in the United States will end. By the time you finish this video, dozens of men will have walked out of a courtroom feeling like they just lost a decade of their lives, their net worth, and their identity. But here is the statistic that almost no one is talking about. Nearly 70% of divorces in the US are initiated by women. When you look at college-educated women, that number jumps to nearly 90%. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in the American domestic contract, a sociological phenomenon that has left millions of men asking the same question. What happened to the deal? For decades, the narrative has been about falling out of love, but the data suggests something much deeper. We are looking at a systemic misalignment between modern legal frameworks and the evolving social expectations of the 21st century. If you are a man in America today, the standard life path you were sold in the 1990s or 2000s is effectively obsolete. Understanding the sociological machinery behind these numbers isn't just about being cynical. It is about survival. It is about understanding the potential outcomes of a system that was built for a world that no longer exists. Today, we are going to deconstruct the mechanics of modern divorce, the historical trends that led us here, and the data-driven reality of what it means to be a man navigating the end of a marriage in the modern United States. This is a deep dive into the sociology of the American divorce, and by the end of this series, you will understand the hidden variables that dictate who keeps what, why the system functions the way it does, and how to navigate the psychological and financial landscape without losing your mind. To understand why divorce feels like a shock to the system for so many men, we have to look at the historical trend of the no-fault divorce revolution. Before the 1970s, ending a marriage required grounds. You had to prove adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. This created a barrier to entry for the legal system. However, starting with California in 1969, the United States shifted toward a system where irreconcilable differences became the standard. Sociologically, this shifted the marriage contract from a binding legal covenant to an at-will partnership. For men, this meant that the security they thought they were building in a family unit could be liquidated at any time without a specific violation of the contract. We see this reflected in the silver divorce trend, where couples over the age of 50 are seeing a massive spike in filings. These are men who spent 30 years building an engine of stability, only to find that the legal oil has been drained out from under them. Let's look at the initiation gap. Why are women filing at such higher rates? Sociologists point to the second shift and emotional labor, but from a male perspective, there is often a silent divorce that happens years before the paperwork is filed. Case studies show a pattern where the male partner believes the relationship is fine because there is a lack of high-conflict fighting, while the female partner is silently auditing the relationship's emotional ROI. By the time she files, she has already processed the grief and has a three-step exit plan, leaving the man in a state of disenfranchised grief. He is blindsided not because he wasn't paying attention, but because he was operating on an old-school metric of success, providing and existing. Furthermore, we have to address the financial asymmetry that defines the modern U.S. landscape. In a sociological sense, the court system still largely views the family through a mid-20th century lens, even as the workforce has shifted. We see this in the concept of standard of living maintenance. In many jurisdictions, the goal of alimony or spousal support is to ensure that the lower-earning spouse can maintain the lifestyle they enjoyed during the marriage. For a man who has been the primary breadwinner, this often creates a scenario where he is subsidizing a household he no longer lives in, while his own standard of living drops by an average of 21% post-divorce. Conversely, research suggests that because of the way assets and support are structured, many women see a smaller drop or even an eventual increase in their discretionary income when child support is factored into the household utility. The impact on social capital is another deep dive area we must explore. For men, the wife often serves as the social secretary. She maintains the links to the community, the extended family, and the friend groups. When the divorce occurs, men often find themselves in a social desert. Their internal support network evaporates because it was never truly theirs to begin with. This leads to what sociologists call male loneliness epidemic post-separation. Statistics show that divorced men are at a significantly higher risk for health complications and a decrease in life expectancy compared to their married or never married counterparts. This isn't just about missing a partner, it's about the total collapse of a man's social ecosystem. We also need to analyze the primary parent bias. While many states are moving toward 50-50 custody as a default, the historical trend still leans toward the tender years doctrine influence, where the mother is seen as the essential nurturer. For the modern father who is active, present, and emotionally invested, the realization that he might be relegated to a visitor status, seeing his children every other weekend, is a psychological trauma that the current legal system is ill-equipped to handle. We see case studies where men, fearing the loss of their children, agree to financial settlements that are borderline predatory just to maintain a 40% timeshare. This brings us to the legal-industrial complex of divorce. The U.S. divorce industry is a multi-billion-dollar machine, thrives on conflict. The more a man fights to protect his assets or his time with his children, the more the billable hours accrue. It is a system of mutually assured destruction. We will be looking at how aggressive representation often results in the total depletion of the marital estate, leaving both parties with less than if they had settled, but with the man often carrying the heavier burden of the legal debt. This part of the masterclass is about setting the stage. You cannot win a game if you don't know the rules, and in the US, the rules of divorce are often unwritten, cultural, and baked into the sociological crust of our institutions. We are going to look at the premarital drift, the post-divorce identity crisis, and the asset protection paradox. If you think this is just about getting a lawyer, you have already lost. This is about understanding the sociological currents that are pulling at your life. We are going to look at why the best interest of the child standard is often used as a weapon, how no fault actually creates a high-fault environment in the shadows, and how the modern man can reconstruct a sense of self when the primary pillars of his life, provider, protector, husband, are stripped away by a 15-minute hearing in a windowless courtroom. We are going to examine the documentation trap. Many men enter the divorce process with a handshake mentality, assuming that years of loyalty will translate into a fair exit. However, historical trends show that the legal system rewards the first mover advantage. The person who files first secures the records first and defines the narrative first, often sets the pace for the entire multi-year process. We will look at data regarding strategic filing and how it impacts the final mediation outcomes. This isn't about being mean. It's about understanding that a divorce is the dissolution of a corporation where you are both the CEO and the employee, and the board of directors is a judge who doesn't know your name. This is part 1 of our 10-part deep dive. We are just scratching the surface of the data. Next, we move into the actual financial mechanics of the lifestyle audit and how the state calculates your future based on your past. The lifestyle audit is the engine room of the modern American divorce machine. It is a process where the state of your union is translated into a series of cold, hard-line items on a spreadsheet. In 2026, this process has become more invasive than ever due to the digital footprint we all leave behind. Imagine a man named David, a software architect in Austin, Texas. David has spent the last 15 years working 60-hour weeks to provide a life for his family. He sees his contributions through the lens of sacrifice and building a legacy. However, when he enters the courtroom, the sociological lens shifts. The court does not see David's sacrifice. It sees a baseline of consumption. This is the first major hurdle for men in the United States. The realization that your hard work has effectively set the bar for your future liabilities. The lifestyle audit begins with a deep dive into the marital standard of living. This is a legal term of art that determines how much money is required to keep your former spouse in the manner to which they have become accustomed. If David took his family on 2 international vacations a year and drove a luxury SUV, the court views those not as luxuries, but as established necessities. The step-by-step reality involves a forensic accountant scouring bank statements, credit card receipts, and even social media posts from 2024 and 2025 to reconstruct a monthly burn rate. This is where many men find themselves in a statistical trap. If the family was spending 100% of David's income to maintain that lifestyle, the court may conclude that the only way to maintain that standard post-divorce is for David to continue transferring a massive percentage of his gross earnings, often leaving him with a lower standard of living than the spouse he is supporting. Case studies from recent years show a growing trend of what sociologists call the gendered wealth gap in dissolution. While the national conversation often focuses on the wage gap, in the context of divorce, we see a divergence in liquid versus illiquid assets. A man often walks away with the retirement account, the 401k or the pension, which is taxable and locked away until he is 65. The spouse, meanwhile, is frequently awarded the primary residence or immediate cash buyouts. This creates a scenario where a man is technically wealthy on paper but functionally broke in his day-to-day life. David might keep a $500,000 retirement fund, but he can't use it to pay rent in 2026 without taking a massive tax hit and early withdrawal penalties. This is the sociology of paper wealth versus practical wealth. Step 2 of the financial mechanics involves the calculation of imputed income. In the modern U.S. landscape, the court doesn't just look at what you are making, it looks at what it thinks you should be making. If David decides the stress of his high-level job is too much and wants to take a lower-paying role to focus on his mental health during the divorce, the court may impute his higher salary anyway. They look at historical trends of his earning capacity and mandate support payments based on a salary he no longer receives. This creates a phenomenon of forced labor, where a man is legally tethered to a high-stress career path simply to meet the obligations of a defunct marriage. The digital era of 2026 has introduced a new layer: the metadata of infidelity and asset hiding. In the past, hiding a secret bank account was a matter of paper trails. Today, forensic algorithms can track Venmo transactions, Zelle transfers, and even cryptocurrency wallets. Case studies show that men often try to mitigate their losses by moving money into digital assets, only to have the court view this as fraudulent transfer. This often results in the court awarding the other spouse a larger share of the remaining visible assets as a penalty. The transparency of the modern financial system means that the lifestyle audit is nearly 100% accurate, leaving very little room for negotiation. Let's talk about the hidden costs of the transition. Most men calculate the cost of a divorce based on the lawyer's retainer. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the U.S. sociological reality. You have to factor in the cost of duplicate households. In 2026, the housing market in major U.S. hubs like Denver, Nashville, or Charlotte is prohibitively expensive. When a household splits, you are effectively doubling the cost of housing, utilities, and insurance while the total income remains the same. For a man like David, this means moving from a 4-bedroom house into a 1-bedroom apartment while still paying the mortgage on the original house. This is the middle-class squeeze of divorce. It is the moment where the sociology of being a provider crashes into the reality of being a single man in an inflated economy. Another critical component is the tax implication of support. Following changes in federal tax law over the last few years, alimony is no longer tax-deductible for the payer, and it is not considered taxable income for the recipient. This was a massive shift in the financial landscape for men. In 2026, if David pays $3,000 a month in spousal support, he is paying that with after-tax dollars. He has to earn roughly $4,500 to give away $3,000. This effectively increases the real-world cost of support by nearly 30 to 40% depending on his tax bracket. The historical trend shows that this has led to more men falling into debt or filing for bankruptcy within 5 years of a divorce decree. We must also address the mental health toll as a financial variable. Sociological data indicates that men are less likely to seek therapy or support during the financial audit phase, leading to burnout and executive dysfunction. This often results in mistakes at work, missed promotions, or even job loss at the exact moment when their financial needs are at an all-time high. Case studies suggest that the psychological weight of the lifestyle audit acts as a feedback loop, where the financial pressure degrades the performance needed to sustain the payments. Step 3 is the division of non-tangible assets. In 2026, this includes things like loyalty points, streaming subscriptions, and even the digital equity of a social media presence or a small side hustle started during the marriage. Everything is on the table. The court views the marriage as a partnership where every ounce of growth is a joint product. Even if David built his side business on his own time at 2 a.m., the state of the law in many jurisdictions considers it marital property. This is the total commodification of the male effort. This brings us to the most volatile part of the financial machine: child support and the percentage of gross income. In the United States, child support is often calculated using a rigid formula that does not take into account the actual cost of raising a child, but rather a percentage of the non-custodial parent's income. If David's income increases because he works overtime to dig himself out of debt, his child support obligation may increase as well. This creates an inverse incentive structure where the more a man works to improve his situation, the more the system extracts from him. As we close this chapter on the financial mechanics, you have to realize that the lifestyle audit is not just about money. It is about the state's power to define your standard of living for the next decade or more. But what happens when the money isn't the only thing being audited? What happens when your very character is put on trial to determine how often you get to see your own children? In the next part, we are going to dive into the high-stakes world of the custody battle, the use of the guardian ad litem, and why being a good dad is often not enough in a system designed for primary caregivers. We will look at how the sociological definition of fatherhood has changed in 2026, and why the courtroom remains the final frontier for the modern father. The courtroom is a theater of definitions, and in 2026, the definition of a father is still being contested between biological reality and sociological tradition. To understand the custody battle, we must first confront the ghost of the tender years doctrine. Historically, this was the legal presumption that during a child's formative years, the mother was the naturally superior caregiver. While this doctrine has been formally abolished in almost every state in favor of the best interests of the child standard, the sociological residue remains thick. In practice, the system often defaults to maintaining the status quo. If a family has operated on a traditional model where the father works outside the home and the mother manages the domestic sphere, the court sees the mother as the primary psychological parent. For a man like Marcus, a project manager in Charlotte, North Carolina, this means his years of providing are used as evidence against his availability as a parent. Imagine if Marcus has spent the last 5 years taking every promotion and every overtime shift to pay for a house in a top-tier school district. In the eyes of the court, his 60-hour work week is not a sacrifice for his children. It is a lifestyle choice that renders him a secondary caregiver. When the divorce proceedings begin, the court looks at the historical breakdown of daily tasks. Who took the child to the pediatrician, who attended the parent-teacher conferences, and who prepared the school lunches. Because Marcus was at the office during those hours to fund the very life his family enjoyed, he finds himself at a statistical disadvantage. This is the provider paradox. The more a man fulfills the traditional role of a provider, the more he risks being legally marginalized as a parent once the marriage dissolves. Step by step, the custody process often begins with the temporary order. This is perhaps the most critical and overlooked phase of a divorce. In many U.S. jurisdictions, the initial arrangement set during the first few weeks of separation becomes the permanent template. If Marcus moves out of the family home to avoid conflict, thinking he is being the bigger person, he has inadvertently created a new status quo where the children live primarily with the mother. By the time a final hearing occurs 18 months later, the court is hesitant to disrupt the children's established routine. This creates a scenario where the temporary becomes the permanent, and the father is relegated to a schedule of every other weekend and one weeknight dinner. We must also analyze the role of the guardian ad litem, or GAL. In high-conflict cases, the court appoints a JL to represent the child's interests. Sociologically, this adds a third party into the intimate dynamics of the family. The GAL conducts home visits, interviews teachers, and reviews medical records. For a father, this process can feel like a perpetual interrogation. Case studies show that fathers often struggle with the performative nature of these evaluations. If a man expresses anger or frustration with the legal process, it is often documented as an inability to co-parent or as evidence of a volatile temperament. Conversely, the same expression of emotion from a mother is frequently interpreted as a natural reaction to the stress of the dissolution. This is a clear example of gendered emotional perception in the U.S. legal system. The year 2026 has seen the rise of the digital custody audit. Courts now routinely examine the communication between parents on apps like Our Family Wizard or Talking Parents. Every text message, every missed call, and every late drop-off is logged, and can be used as evidence of a father's lack of cooperation. Imagine Marcus sends a frustrated text at 11 p.m. after his ex-wife denies him a FaceTime call with his kids. That single message can be used 6 months later to paint a picture of a man who is emotionally unstable or harassing. The modern father is effectively living in a 24/7 surveillance state where his fitness as a parent is judged by the tone of his digital interactions. Historical trends indicate that even as more states like Florida and Kentucky move toward a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 shared parenting, the implementation remains inconsistent. There is a sociological lag between legislation and the behavior of local judges. Many judges, particularly those who have been on the bench for decades, still view the weekend dad model as the most stable for the child. This leads to the phenomenon of the 60-40 split, which is just enough of a difference to keep the child support calculation significantly higher for the father. In many formulas used across the U.S., dropping below a certain percentage of overnights triggers a massive increase in the financial transfer, creating a financial incentive for the primary parent to resist true 50-50 shared custody. Furthermore, we need to address the impact of parental alienation. While it is a controversial term in some sociological circles, the data shows a pattern where children are subtly or overtly encouraged to distance themselves from the non-custodial parent. In 2026, this often manifests through social media or the gatekeeping of extracurricular activities. If Marcus is not informed about a soccer game until an hour before it starts, and he is at work, his absence is framed to the child as a lack of interest. Over time, this creates a psychological rift that the court often interprets as the child's own preference. When a 12-year-old tells a jail they would rather stay with their mother because dad is always busy, the court rarely digs into the sociological grooming that led to that statement. The custody battle also involves the psychological evaluation. These are often conducted by forensic psychologists who use standardized tests like the MMPI-3. These tests were not originally designed for the high-stress environment of a divorce, yet their results can carry immense weight. A man who is naturally guarded or stoic may be flagged for lack of emotional transparency, while a man who is overly expressive may be flagged for impulsivity. It is a narrow path to walk. Case studies highlight that men who succeed in these evaluations are often those who have been coached to suppress their natural reactions to the trauma of losing their family unit. We must also consider the sociological shift in fatherhood identities. In 2026, men are more involved in the day-to-day upbringing of their children than at any point in American history. They are the ones at the playgroups, the ones doing the bedtime stories, and the ones managing the school schedules. Yet, when they enter the legal arena, they are often met with a system that treats their involvement as a novelty rather than a right. This creates a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. A man goes from being a 100% partner in a home to a 20% visitor in a legal document. The psychological impact of this demotion is one of the leading causes of the post-divorce depression observed in modern U.S. men. The custody machine is also fueled by the relocation debate. In our mobile society, it is common for a parent to want to move for a new job or to be closer to their own family. In the U.S., the primary parent often has a significant advantage in relocation hearings. If Marcus's ex-wife wants to move from North Carolina to California, Marcus is faced with a choice: quit his job and move to a more expensive state to stay near his kids, or stay and see them only on holidays. The court often permits these moves if they can be framed as an improvement in the primary parent's quality of life, effectively ending the father's ability to be a present parent. As we conclude this deep dive into the custody battle, it becomes clear that being a good father is only half the battle. The other half is surviving the sociological and legal structures that are designed to categorize you as a secondary figure. But the battle for the children is often inextricably linked to the battle for the truth. What happens when the accusations move beyond simple parenting styles and into the realm of character assassination? What happens when the legal system is used not just to divide time, but to destroy a man's reputation? In the next part, we are going to explore the darkest corner of the modern U.S. divorce, the rise of false allegations, the mechanics of protective orders, and how the shield of the law can be turned into a weapon of total exclusion. We will look at the step-by-step reality of how a single phone call can change a man's legal standing in a matter of minutes. The transition from a domestic dispute to a legal emergency is often instantaneous. In the modern United States, the mechanism for this transition is the ex parte protective order. To understand the sociology of this phenomenon, we must look at how the legal system prioritizes immediate safety over due process in the early stages of a filing. Imagine a man named Christopher, a high school history teacher in suburban Ohio. It is a Tuesday evening in 2026. After a heated argument about the division of assets, Christopher's wife calls 911. She does not report a physical assault, but rather expresses that she feels unsafe or intimidated by his tone of voice. Under the prevailing sociological and legal standards of 2026, the police are often required to remove one party from the home to de-escalate the situation. Because of historical trends and the structural layout of domestic violence statutes, that party is almost always the man. The step-by-step reality of a protective order, often colloquially called a restraining order, begins with an ex parte hearing. Ex parte is Latin for from one party, meaning Christopher is not present. He is not even aware the hearing is happening. A judge, operating on the principle of extreme caution, reviews a written affidavit. In 2026, the threshold for issuing a temporary order is remarkably low. If the affidavit contains the right keywords, fear, intimidation, or control, the judge signs the order. Within hours, Christopher is served by a sheriff at his place of work or at a friend's house. He is instantly barred from entering his own home, seeing his children, or possessing his firearms. This is the silver bullet of divorce litigation. It is a legal maneuver that grants one party total control of the marital residence and the children without a single piece of forensic evidence or a cross-examination. Sociologically, this creates a state of legal infamy for the man. Even if the allegations are eventually proven to be unsubstantiated, the temporary order remains on Christopher's record during the most sensitive phase of the divorce. Case studies from the last few years show that these orders are frequently used as strategic leverage. By removing Christopher from the home, the opposing side establishes an immediate status quo of primary custody. When Christopher finally gets his day in court, usually 14 to 21 days later, he is already behind. He has been living out of a suitcase, his relationship with his children has been interrupted, and he is viewed by the court through a lens of suspicion. In the US, the sociology of the victim-perpetrator binary is so deeply embedded that once the label of defendant is applied in a domestic context, it is incredibly difficult to shed. We must also examine the phenomenon of character assassination via social media. In 2026, the court of public opinion moves faster than the Ohio Revised Code. Before Christopher even speaks to a lawyer, his social circle, his employer, and his neighbors may have already seen vague or explicit posts regarding his alleged behavior. This is what sociologists call social death. For a man whose identity is tied to his professional reputation and his standing in the community, this digital trail acts as a secondary, non-legal punishment. Even if a judge eventually vacates the protective order, the digital footprint remains. Historical trends suggest that employers in 2026 are increasingly risk-averse. A simple headline or a viral post can lead to an administrative leave of absence, further destabilizing the man's financial ability to defend himself. The use of false allegations as a tactical tool is a reality that many legal professionals acknowledge behind closed doors, but rarely discuss on the record. In high-conflict divorces, the incentive structure of the law practically invites it. If an allegation of misconduct results in exclusive possession of $1 million home and a favorable child support calculation, the cost-benefit analysis for a desperate or angry spouse becomes skewed. Step by step, we see the escalation. It starts with a disagreement over a 401k, moves to a verbal altercation, and ends with a petition for a domestic violence injunction. The data indicates that in over 80% of these temporary orders, no physical violence is ever alleged, yet the legal consequences for the man are identical to those in cases of actual physical harm. Furthermore, we need to address the impact of mandatory arrest laws. Many U.S. states have policies that require officers to make an arrest if they are called to a domestic scene and see any sign of a struggle, such as a broken plate or a torn shirt. In the heat of a divorce, these scenes are easily manufactured or misinterpreted. Once Christopher is in the system, he faces the criminal-civil overlap. His civil divorce attorney now has to coordinate with a criminal defense attorney. The cost of his legal defense triples overnight. The sociology of this is profound. The state has effectively weaponized the criminal justice system to settle a civil contract dispute. This leads to a massive transfer of wealth from the family unit to the legal and bail bond industries. Imagine if Christopher's case involves a guardian ad litem. As we discussed in the previous part, the presence of a protective order, even a temporary one, heavily influences the gal's initial report. The GAL is trained to prioritize safety above all else. Consequently, they may recommend supervised visitation for Christopher. Imagine a father who has been the primary coach for his son's baseball team now being told he can only see his children for 2 hours a week in a windowless room at a social services center, monitored by a stranger with a clipboard. This is the total dehumanization of the father-child bond. The psychological trauma this inflicts on the man and the children is often permanent. It creates an associative stigma where the child begins to view the father as someone dangerous, simply because the environment of their meetings suggests it. In 2026, we are also seeing the rise of administrative weapons, such as calls to Child Protective Services or CPS. A spouse may report that Christopher has a drinking problem, or that the house is unsafe. Even if the investigation is closed as unfounded, the mere existence of the file is a black mark. Sociological data shows that men are investigated by CPS at higher rates for neglect following a divorce filing than women. This is part of a broader trend of systemic scrutiny. The modern U.S. man is under a microscope where every flaw is magnified and every virtue is ignored. Case studies highlight that the only way to navigate this minefield is through radical transparency. Men in 2026 are increasingly turning to wearable technology, such as body cameras or continuous audio recording on their phones, to protect themselves from false claims. This is a staggering sociological shift. The home, once a sanctuary, has become a space of surveillance. A man like Christopher may feel the need to record every interaction with his spouse to ensure he has an alibi against a future affidavit. This environment of total distrust is the natural endgame of a legal system that rewards the first person to claim the status of a victim. As we conclude this analysis of the weaponization of the law, it is clear that the modern divorce is not just a negotiation. It is a high-stakes defensive operation. The protective order is the heavy artillery of this conflict, capable of leveling a man's life in a single afternoon. But what happens after the smoke clears? What happens when the legal battle moves from the courtroom to the counting house, and the man realizes that his future earnings, the very sweat of his brow for the next 20 years, have been pre-allocated to a life he no longer leads? In the next part, we are going to dive deep into the alimony trap, the sociology of perpetual dependency, and why the concept of a clean break is a myth in the modern American legal landscape. We will look at how the state views your future labor as a marital asset to be distributed. The myth of the clean break is perhaps the most dangerous sociological delusion a man can carry into a U.S. courtroom in 2026. In the American legal consciousness, we often view divorce as an exit ramp, but for a high-earning man, it is more accurately described as a permanent restructuring of his labor. To understand this, we must examine the concept of human capital as a marital asset. Imagine a man named Jonathan, a senior systems engineer in Seattle. Jonathan has been married for 18 years. During that time, he climbed the corporate ladder, earned his certifications, and increased his salary fourfold. His wife, by mutual agreement or historical trend, took a back seat in her career to manage the household. In the eyes of modern U.S. sociology and the family court, Jonathan's ability to earn $250,000 a year is not an individual achievement. It is a joint venture. The state views Jonathan's future labor, the actual physical and mental energy he will expend in 2027, 2028, and beyond, as something that was cultivated within the marital greenhouse. Therefore, a portion of that future energy is owed back to the former partner. This is the foundation of alimony, or what many states now call spousal maintenance. The step-by-step calculation of this maintenance is where the trap is set. In 2026, many jurisdictions use a formula that looks at the length of the marriage and the income disparity between the parties. If Jonathan has been married for over 15 years, he is often entering the territory of long-term maintenance. In some states, this can last for half the length of the marriage. In others, it remains open-ended until a significant change in circumstances occurs. The sociology of perpetual dependency arises when the court determines that the lower-earning spouse is unable to become self-supporting at a standard of living reasonably comparable to that enjoyed during the marriage. This is a subjective and incredibly high bar. For Jonathan, this means that even though his ex-wife is capable of working a mid-level administrative job, the court may decide she shouldn't have to live a mid-level life because she was a senior engineer's wife for 2 decades. Case studies show that this creates a disincentive for self-sufficiency. If the recipient spouse earns more money, their alimony check might decrease. Consequently, the legal system accidentally incentivizes the lower-earning spouse to remain underemployed, while the higher-earning man is legally obligated to remain overemployed to cover the gap. We must also analyze the modification minefield. Men often believe that if their circumstances change, if they get sick, if the industry shifts, or if they simply burn out, the system will adapt. However, the historical trend in U.S. courts is that downward modifications are notoriously difficult to secure. To lower his payments, Jonathan must prove a substantial and material change in circumstances. This requires more legal fees, more forensic accounting, and more time in front of a judge who may view his decreased earnings as voluntary impoverishment. Imagine if Jonathan's company downsizes in late 2026. He finds a new job, but it pays 30% less. The court may rule that because he has the capacity to earn more, his obligation remains at the old level. This is the imputation of earning capacity, and it effectively turns a man's potential into a debt he can never fully discharge. The year 2026 has introduced a new layer of complexity: the portability of benefits and retirement equity. In the past, alimony ended when the payer retired. Today, sociologists observe that courts are increasingly aggressive in dividing the future. This includes the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. This legal instrument carves out a portion of Jonathan's pension or 401k before he ever sees it. For many men, the realization that 50% of their retirement savings, which they spent 30 years accumulating, is gone in an instant is a secondary trauma. This creates a sociological class of working-class seniors, men in their late 60s and 70s who cannot afford to retire because their liquid assets were divided a decade earlier, and their remaining income is still tied up in maintenance. Let's look at the remarriage variable. Sociologically, men in the US tend to remarry at higher rates and faster than women after a divorce. However, the legal system creates a financial ceiling on these new families. While Jonathan's alimony might end if his ex-wife remarries, it does not end if he remarries. In fact, his new wife's income can sometimes be factored into his household's ability to pay his legal fees or other obligations, though not usually the alimony itself. This creates a scenario where the new wife is effectively subsidizing the previous marriage. This is a major point of friction in modern American sociology, leading to the collapse of second marriages at a rate of nearly 60%. The ghost of the first marriage's financial structure haunts the second, creating a cycle of perpetual litigation. Case studies also highlight the weaponization of cohabitation. In 2026, many alimony orders state that payments end if the recipient cohabitates with a new partner. This leads to a sociological game of cat and mouse. The former spouse may live with a significant other, but keep their finances separate, or maintain a nominal separate residence to keep the alimony checks flowing. For Jonathan, this means hiring a private investigator to prove his ex-wife is effectively living a married life with someone else. The cost of this surveillance and the subsequent legal battle often outweighs the potential savings, leaving the man in a state of financial paralysis. Furthermore, we must address the life insurance requirement. In the United States, it is common for the court to order the paying man to maintain a massive life insurance policy with the ex-wife as the sole beneficiary. This is to secure the alimony and child support payments in the event of his death. Sociologically, this creates a bizarre and uncomfortable reality. The man is worth more to his former partner dead than alive. For Jonathan, paying the premiums on $1 million policy for a woman who no longer speaks to him is a monthly reminder of his status as a financial utility rather than a human being. Step by step, the alimony trap dissolves a man's incentive to innovate or take risks. Why would Jonathan start a new business or move for a better opportunity if any increase in his success results in a potential claim for more support? This leads to what sociologists call professional stagnation in divorced men. They become risk-averse, staying in soul-crushing jobs just to maintain the steady cash flow required by the court decree. The clean break was the promise of the 1970s no-fault revolution, but in 2026, the data shows that for the American man, marriage is a contract with a lifelong tail. The state's view of your labor as a marital asset is not just a financial calculation. It is a sociological statement on the value of male effort. It suggests that once you enter the contract of marriage, your future self is no longer entirely your own. This brings us to the most critical realization for any man navigating this landscape. If your labor is a marital asset, then your mental health is the infrastructure that sustains that asset. But what happens when the infrastructure breaks? What happens when the weight of the audit, the custody battle, and the alimony trap leads to a total system failure? In the next part, we are going to explore the psychological siege of divorce, the sociological roots of the male suicide rate post-separation, and the step-by-step process of rebuilding an identity when the state has stripped away every traditional marker of your success. We will look at why the most important asset you need to protect isn't in your bank account. It is the space between your ears. The psychological siege of a modern American divorce is not a single event, but a war of attrition against a man's sense of reality. In the United States, sociology tells us that a man's identity is often constructed through three primary pillars: his role as a provider, his status as a father, and his position as a protector. When a divorce filing occurs in 2026, all three of these pillars are not just shaken, they are often systematically dismantled by the state. Imagine a man named Robert, a civil engineer in Denver. For 20 years, Robert has viewed himself through the lens of his utility. He builds bridges, he pays the mortgage, and he maintains the family home. Suddenly, he is served with papers. Within weeks, the legal system tells him he is no longer the provider. He is a source of garnishment. He is no longer the protector. He is a potential liability restricted by temporary orders. He is no longer a daily father. He is a visitor on a schedule. This is the sociological phenomenon of role stripping. For Robert, the psychological impact begins with what researchers call identity foreclosure. Because he has spent his entire adult life pouring his ego into these specific roles, he has no secondary self to fall back on. When the roles are gone, the person disappears. In 2026, we see this manifesting in a staggering increase in male isolation. Case studies show that as the legal process drags on, men like Robert begin to withdraw from their social circles, often out of a sense of shame or a feeling that they have failed at the most basic level of the social contract. This is the first step of the siege, the isolation of the target. The step-by-step breakdown of the psychological siege often follows a predictable path of cognitive dissonance. In the first phase, the man tries to reconcile the person he was married to with the person now litigating against him. In the US, the adversarial nature of our legal system requires a spouse to frame their partner as a deficit to justify their legal claims for assets or custody. Reading a legal brief where your character is assassinated by the person who knew you best creates a profound psychological rupture. Robert reads that he was emotionally unavailable, or that his dedication to his career was actually neglect. This rewriting of history is a form of sociological gaslighting sanctioned by the courtroom. Historical trends in the 2020s have shown that the risk of self-harm for men in the first year, following a divorce filing, is significantly higher than for women or married men. Sociologists attribute this to the loss of social capital. In the American domestic structure, the wife is often the emotional hub of the family. She maintains the connections to neighbors, extended family, and the school community. When she leaves, Robert finds that those social threads are severed. He isn't just losing a wife, he is losing his entire social ecosystem. He goes from a crowded Sunday dinner to a silent apartment in a suburb where he knows no one. This rapid transition from high-density social interaction to total isolation is a primary driver of the mental health crisis in divorced men. Another critical element is the erosion of agency. In 2026, every major decision in Robert's life is now subject to the approval of a third party. He cannot move, he cannot change his spending habits, and he cannot decide when to see his children without checking a legal document or consulting a lawyer at $400 an hour. This loss of autonomy is psychologically devastating for men, who are socialized to be the masters of their own fate. It leads to a state of learned helplessness, where the man feels that no matter how hard he works or how well he behaves, the outcome is already predetermined by a system that does not see him as an individual. Let's look at the case study of the performance trap. During the divorce, Robert is told he must remain stoic. If he shows anger, he is a threat. If he shows sadness, he is weak. If he is indifferent, he doesn't care about his family. This creates a psychological double bind. He is forced to perform a version of himself that is acceptable to the court, but this performance prevents him from actually processing the trauma he is experiencing. Sociological data suggests that this suppressed grief often resurfaces as chronic health issues, heart disease, or substance abuse. By the time the final decree is signed in late 2026, Robert may have won 50% of his assets, but he has lost 100% of his physical and mental vitality. Furthermore, we must address the disenfranchised grief associated with losing the home. In the United States, a man's home is his castle, not just as a cliché, but as a sociological marker of his success. Being forced out of that space while still being required to pay for it is a unique form of psychological torture. Robert drives past the house he renovated with his own hands, seeing another man's car in the driveway, or seeing his children playing in the yard, while he lives in a rental. This is a constant, visible reminder of his displaced status. It prevents the closure necessary to move forward, keeping the man in a state of perpetual mourning for a life that still exists but is no longer his. Step by step, the rebuilding process requires what sociologists call radical identity reconstruction. In 2026, the men who successfully navigate the psychological siege are those who find a way to anchor their identity in something other than their utility to others. This is a difficult transition in a culture that values men primarily for what they provide. Robert has to learn to value himself as a man independent of his bank account, his job title, or his marital status. This often involves finding new communities, such as men-only support groups or fitness communities, where the focus is on personal growth rather than social utility. However, the legal system often interrupts this reconstruction. Just as Robert begins to find his footing, a new motion is filed, or a disagreement over summer vacation schedules arises, pulling him back into the trauma. This is the intermittent reinforcement of the divorce process. It keeps the man's nervous system in a state of high alert for years. The long-term physiological cost of this sustained cortisol spike is a major factor in the decreased life expectancy of divorced men in the U.S. As we look at the data for 2026, we see a shift toward more men seeking mental health support specifically tailored to the divorce experience. This is a positive historical trend, but it is often a race against time. The psychological siege is designed to break the man before he can rebuild. It is a system that treats the human element of the family unit as an afterthought to the distribution of property and the calculation of support. Protecting the space between your ears means realizing that the court can take your house, your money, and your time, but it cannot take your character unless you surrender it. But even for the most resilient man, there is a final looming question. After the lawyers are paid, the house is sold, and the custody is settled, what is left? What does the future look like for the millions of American men who find themselves starting over in their 40s, 50s, or 60s? In the next part, we are going to explore the sociology of the second act, the reality of the modern dating market for divorced men, the challenges of blending families, and why the red pill versus blue pill debate is dominating the conversation for men in 2026. We will look at whether the system can ever be truly navigated, or if the only way to win is to never play the game in the first place. The sociology of the second act for a divorced man in 2026 is a landscape defined by extreme polarization. After the legal machinery has finished its work, a man enters a social and romantic environment that has fundamentally transformed since he was last single. To understand this transition, we must look at the digital commodification of the self. Imagine a man named Steven, a 45-year-old manager from Atlanta who has just finalized his divorce after 22 years. Steven enters a world where his value is no longer determined by his local reputation or his history, but by his profile on a mobile application. This is the first major sociological hurdle, the shift from the social market to the digital market. In 2026, the dating market in the United States has reached a state of hyper-efficiency. For a man like Steven, his primary challenge is the data-driven selection bias. Sociological studies in 2025 indicated that the top 10% of men on dating platforms receive the vast majority of engagement. As a divorced man who may be carrying the financial and psychological weight of the last few years, Steven often finds himself in a statistical dead zone. He is competing with younger men who have no alimony obligations and fewer emotional scars. This creates a phenomenon known as the sexual market value gap. Steven's years of building a career and a home, which were his primary assets in the marriage market of 2004, are now viewed through a lens of utility rather than attraction. We must also analyze the red pill versus blue pill sociological conflict that dominates the digital discourse for men in 2026. This isn't just internet subculture. It is a profound philosophical divergence in how men perceive the American social contract. The blue pill perspective represents the traditional idealistic view of marriage and partnership. The idea that if you are a good man, work hard, and provide, you will have a stable family life. For Steven, the divorce shattered this worldview. He is now gravitating toward the red pill perspective, which views the modern legal and social system as inherently genocentric and adversarial to men. This shift in consciousness is a reaction to the perceived failure of the traditional model. Case studies show that men who adopt this more cynical, survivalist mindset often report a greater sense of control, but they also risk a total detachment from the possibility of a meaningful future partnership. Step by step, the re-entry process often leads to the blended family friction. If Steven decides to date and eventually cohabitate with another woman, he enters a sociological minefield known as the step-parent trap. In 2026, the legal definition of family is expanding, but the social boundaries are becoming more rigid. If Steven's new partner has children, he is expected to provide emotional and sometimes financial support for them, yet he has zero legal authority over them. Meanwhile, his own children may view the new partner as an intruder or a replacement for their mother. This creates a state of perpetual conflict. Historical trends suggest that second and third marriages involving children from previous relationships have a significantly higher failure rate because the competing loyalties to the new spouse versus the biological children are nearly impossible to balance. Furthermore, we must address the sociology of the bachelorhood stigma. In the United States, a man over 40 who is single and not actively seeking a new wife is often viewed with suspicion or pity. However, in 2026, a growing number of men are choosing a path of voluntary withdrawal. This is often referred to as MGTOW, or men going their own way. Sociologists are tracking a significant rise in men who, after experiencing the financial and emotional destruction of a divorce, decide that the risk-to-reward ratio of a new marriage is simply too high. For Stephen, the idea of signing another legal contract that grants the state the power to seize his future assets seems illogical. This is a fundamental breakdown of the American domestic incentive structure. If the most productive men in society decide to opt out of the family unit, the long-term sociological implications for the U.S. birth rate and social stability are massive. Let's look at the case study of the financial recovery curve. In 2026, the cost of living in major cities means that a divorced man like Stephen is often living in a state of financial limbo. He earns a six-figure salary, but after taxes, alimony, and child support, his discretionary income is that of an entry-level worker. When he attempts to date, he finds that the cost of courtship has inflated. The sociology of the date-as interview is prevalent. His potential partners are auditing his financial stability just as rigorously as the court did. If Stephen cannot provide the lifestyle that a woman of his age cohort expects, he is filtered out by the algorithm. This creates a feedback loop where the financial aftermath of the first marriage prevents the formation of a second, leaving the man in a state of forced bachelorhood. Another critical element is the digital footprint audit. Before a second date, Stephen's name will be searched on Google, his LinkedIn will be scrutinized, and his social media will be analyzed for any sign of a messy past. In 2026, there is no such thing as a clean slate. Any public record of his divorce or any social media posts from his ex-wife regarding their conflict acts as a permanent black mark. This is the sociology of the permanent record. For men, whose reputations are often fragile in the wake of a domestic dispute, this digital reality makes it nearly impossible to escape the ghost of the previous relationship. The second act also involves the physical maintenance requirement. Sociologists observe that divorced men in 2026 are spending record amounts on fitness, hair restoration, and cosmetic procedures. This is a desperate attempt to maintain sexual market value in a market that favors youth. For Stephen, the realization that he must now compete on physical grounds, after decades of being told his value was in his character and his provision, is a jarring shift. It leads to what researchers call the midlife performance crisis, where the pressure to be both a provider for his old life and a physical specimen for his new life leads to burnout. Step by step, the man must decide if he will double down on the traditional model or pivot to a new way of existing. We see the rise of the digital nomad lifestyle for divorced men. Men who move to countries with a lower cost of living or different social norms to escape the financial and social weight of the U.S. system. This is the ultimate sociological exit. If Stephen moves his remote engineering job to a country where his income goes 5 times further and the social expectations of men are different, he has effectively hacked the system. This trend of the international man is a direct response to the perceived hostility of the modern American domestic landscape. As we examine the data for 2026, it is clear that the second act is not a recovery, it is a total reinvention. But even if Stephen manages to navigate the dating apps, the blended family drama, and the financial hurdles, there is one final wall he must climb. He must face the aging process without the traditional support system he was promised when he first said his vows. What happens when the man who was always the protector and provider becomes the one who needs protection? In the next part, we are going to explore the sociology of the aging divorced male, the reality of the male loneliness epidemic in senior years, and why the final years of a divorced man's life are the ultimate test of the decisions he made in the courtroom decades earlier. We will look at the step-by-step reality of isolation and the hidden health crisis that no one is talking about. The sociology of the aging divorced male in the United States is a study in structural solitude. As we move into the later stages of life, the decisions made during the initial dissolution of the marriage begin to manifest as physical and social realities. To understand this, we must look at the kinship gap. In American sociology, women are traditionally the king-keepers, the individuals who maintain the holiday traditions, the birthday calendars, and the emotional bonds with adult children. When a man like Thomas, a 62-year-old retired architect in Phoenix, looks at his life in 2026, he often finds that his connection to his children is mediated through his ex-wife. If the divorce was high conflict or involved the subtle alienation we discussed earlier, Thomas may find himself in a state of social atrophy. Imagine if Thomas spent his 50s and 60s working to fulfill alimony obligations and rebuilding his own modest savings. He has successfully navigated the financial audit, but he has failed the social audit. While his ex-wife is surrounded by grandchildren and a robust community of friends she cultivated over decades, Thomas is living in a high-rise condo where he knows no one. This is not just a personal tragedy, it is a public health crisis. Sociological data from 2026 indicates that social isolation in senior men is a greater predictor of early mortality than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The lack of a domestic partner means there is no one to notice the early symptoms of illness, no one to encourage healthy habits, and no one to provide the cognitive stimulation required to ward off dementia. Step by step, the aging process for a divorced man becomes a series of logistical failures. Let's look at the case study of the caregiving vacuum. In a traditional marriage, spouses provide informal care for one another as they age. Without that partner, Thomas must rely on the professional care industry. However, because his retirement assets were split 50-50 in 2012, and he spent a significant portion of his peak earning years paying out maintenance, he lacks the capital to afford high-quality assisted living. He is caught in the senior gap. Too wealthy for state-subsidized care, but too poor for the luxury care that provides social engagement. This leads to a historical trend where divorced men are found to be living in substandard conditions at a much higher rate than their married peers. Furthermore, we must address the sociology of fatherhood in the sunset years. For men who were relegated to every other weekend status during their children's formative years, the bond with their adult children is often fragile. In 2026, adult children are often squeezed by their own economic pressures and the needs of their own families. When they have to choose where to spend their limited time and resources, they statistically prioritize the parent who is the primary caregiver. Thomas finds that he is the secondary parent even in his old age. He is the person they call on Father's Day, but not the person they visit on a random Tuesday. This secondary status creates a deep sense of disenfranchised purpose. A man who spent his life thinking he was building a legacy discovers that his legacy has been partitioned. The year 2026 has also highlighted the health-wealth intersection. For divorced men, the cumulative stress of the legal battles, the financial strain, and the social isolation often results in chronic cortisol exposure. This leads to higher rates of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. When Thomas suffers a health setback, the recovery period is longer and more difficult because he lacks the domestic support system that married men enjoy. This is the physiological cost of a legal decree. The court divided the house and the bank accounts, but it could not divide the burden of aging. Case studies from the U.S. Department of Health suggest that divorced men over 65 are hospitalized more frequently for preventable conditions because they lack the early intervention monitoring of a spouse. We must also analyze the psychology of the empty house. For a man who defined himself as a protector and provider, the quiet of a house that no longer rings with the voices of family is a psychological weight. In 2026, this has led to a rise in what sociologists call gray alcoholism. Men like Thomas, who no longer have the daily accountability of a family unit, often turn to substances to fill the silence. It is a slow, quiet decline that happens behind closed doors in the suburbs of America. This is a direct consequence of a culture that encourages men to be utility-based. When the utility ends, either through retirement or the children growing up, the man feels obsolete. Let's look at the impact of the digital divide in senior years. While younger men can use technology to mitigate isolation, many men in Thomas's cohort struggle with the rapidly evolving digital landscape of 2026. If his social world moved onto platforms he doesn't understand, he becomes functionally invisible. The sociology of the invisible man is a recurring theme in research on divorced seniors. They move through the world, they go to the grocery store, they sit in the park, but they have no meaningful interactions. This lack of social mirroring, where others acknowledge your presence and value, leads to a rapid decline in self-esteem and cognitive function. Step by step, the reconstruction of a senior life requires a complete pivot toward community-based living. However, U.S. urban planning is largely designed for nuclear families in detached homes. For Thomas, finding a community of peers requires a level of initiative that his years of psychological siege may have drained. Historical trends show that men are less likely than women to join social clubs, volunteer, or participate in community centers. They are socialized to find their community at work or at home. When both are gone, they are left without a map. The final years of a divorced man are also shaped by the inheritance friction. In 2026, the complexity of blended families or the distance created by divorce often leads to contentious estate planning. Thomas may want to leave what remains of his wealth to his children, but he may also feel a sense of resentment if those children have been distant. Conversely, if he has remarried, the conflict between the new spouse and the children from the first marriage over the remaining assets can lead to a final, posthumous legal battle. This ensures that the conflict, which began in a divorce attorney's office decades ago, continues even after the man is gone. As we examine the data for 2026, it is clear that the aging divorced male is the canary in the coal mine for the American family structure. The system of divorce is designed for the short-term division of assets, but it fails to account for the long-term human requirement for connection and care. Thomas is the end result of a process that treats a family as a contract rather than an organism. But is there a way to see this coming? Is there a set of early warning signs in a marriage or a divorce process that can prevent this outcome? In the next part, we are going to explore the sociology of the warning signs, the data-driven indicators that a marriage is entering the danger zone, and the step-by-step strategies that men are using in 2026 to protect their social and emotional futures before the first paper is ever served. We will look at the intersection of artificial intelligence, behavior tracking, and the future of marital counseling. The sociology of marital dissolution in 2026 has moved from the realm of intuition to the realm of predictive analytics. For the modern American man, the ability to read the warning signs is no longer just about emotional intelligence. It is about understanding the data-driven patterns that precede a legal filing. In the United States, we are seeing a shift where technology is used to audit the health of a relationship in real time. Imagine a man named Daniel, a data analyst in Chicago. Daniel lives in a world where his digital interactions, spending habits, and even the tone of his voice are tracked by various domestic AI systems. To understand the warning signs, Daniel doesn't just look for arguments. He looks for the sociological shift in the power dynamic and the emotional withdrawal phase. The first major warning sign in the modern era is the financial segregation trend. Historically, in the United States, joint bank accounts were the standard for married couples. However, case studies from 2025 and 2026 show a significant move toward separate but equal banking. While this is often framed as a move toward independence sociologically, it is frequently the first step in the decoupling process. If Daniel notices his spouse opening a new individual account or redirecting a portion of her paycheck without a clear mutual goal, he is witnessing the creation of an exit fund. This is the financial infrastructure of a divorce being laid months, or even years, before a petition is filed. It allows one party to secure liquid capital that the other party may not be able to track immediately, creating a strategic advantage in the initial phase of the litigation. Another critical indicator is the sociology of the social media pivot. In 2026, our digital personas are often more curated than our physical lives. A major warning sign is the sudden scrubbing or rebranding of a spouse's digital identity. If Daniel's wife suddenly changes her profile pictures from family-oriented shots to individual portraits, or if she begins posting about personal empowerment and new beginnings, she is signaling a shift in her internal narrative. This is what sociologists call narrative reframing. She is preparing her social circle for a change in status. By the time the announcement is made, her community has already been conditioned to see her as an independent entity rather than one half of a couple. This digital grooming of the social circle is a hallmark of the modern U.S. divorce. Step by step, we must also look at the communication decay and the rise of contempt. Sociologist John Gottman famously identified the 4 horsemen of a relationship, but in 2026 we have identified a 5th: digital stonewalling. This is the practice of using technology to avoid emotional intimacy. If Daniel finds that his most important conversations are happening over text rather than face-to-face, or if his spouse uses the Do Not Disturb feature as a shield against communication, the relationship is in the danger zone. The data shows that when couples stop resolving conflict in person and move it to an asynchronous digital format, the likelihood of a permanent rift increases by nearly 40%. This is because digital communication lacks the hormonal and empathetic cues required for true reconciliation. We are also seeing the emergence of AI-driven marital audits. In 2026, some couples are using specialized applications that analyze their text messages and calendar entries to detect patterns of neglect or escalating conflict. While intended to help, these tools often provide the first hard data that a marriage is failing. For Daniel, an AI alert stating that the sentiment analysis of his household communication has dropped into the negative for 3 consecutive months is a sociological red flag. It provides an objective metric for what he may have been feeling but was unable to quantify. This is the quantified self movement applied to the marriage contract. Furthermore, we must address the sociology of the new friend group. Case studies suggest that one of the most reliable predictors of a divorce filing is the sudden immersion of a spouse into a new social circle of recently divorced individuals. In the U.S., divorce is often socially contagious. When a spouse begins spending significant time with people who have successfully navigated the system and are now enjoying a new phase of life, the perceived cost of leaving the marriage drops. The new group provides the sociological validation and the roadmap for the exit. For Daniel, observing this shift in his spouse's social capital is a sign that the domestic contract is being compared to an alternative that looks increasingly attractive. The year 2026 has also highlighted the warning sign of the professional pivot. If a spouse who has been out of the workforce or underemployed suddenly pursues aggressive career growth, certifications, or advanced degrees, they may be preparing for the financial reality of being single. While personal growth is generally positive, in the context of a failing marriage, it is often a defensive maneuver. The sociology of the career-first exit suggests that the individual is building the capacity to meet the court's requirements for self-sufficiency or, conversely, to increase their own leverage in the eventual asset division. Let's look at the case study of the scheduled intimacy collapse. In a healthy marriage, intimacy is a byproduct of connection. In a pre-divorce marriage, intimacy often becomes a transactional or performative act. If Daniel notices that the physical connection in his marriage has moved from spontaneous to non-existent, or if it is used as a bargaining chip for other concessions, he is witnessing the total breakdown of the marital bond. Sociologists refer to this as the commodification of affection. When the biological and emotional glue of the relationship is gone, the legal structure is the only thing left holding the unit together, and that structure is designed to break under pressure. Step by step, the response to these warning signs is shifting in 2026. Men are increasingly turning to proactive mediation. This is the practice of engaging a professional to facilitate a mid-marriage contract or a post-nuptial agreement before the conflict reaches a point of no return. By addressing the financial and logistical fears early, some couples are able to stabilize the marriage. However, historical trends indicate that by the time these warning signs are visible to the average man, the other spouse has often been contemplating an exit for 6 to 18 months. This is the information asymmetry of the modern divorce. One person is playing a long-term strategic game while the other is still trying to figure out why the weekend plans changed. Finally, we must look at the warning sign of the total transparency demand. Ironically, when a relationship is nearing its end, one party may suddenly demand total access to the other's phones, emails, and financial records under the guise of rebuilding trust. In the sociological landscape of 2026, this is often a fact-finding mission. The information gathered during this period of high transparency is frequently saved, screenshotted, and handed to a lawyer 3 months later. It is a strategic audit disguised as an emotional olive branch. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, it is clear that the warning signs are there for those who know how to read the data. But even with the best tracking and the most acute awareness, some divorces are inevitable. The question then becomes, how do you end it without destroying everything? How do you navigate the final steps of this process in a way that preserves your dignity, your future, and your sanity? In the final part of our series, we are going to look at the sociology of the elegant exit, the strategies for collaborative divorce, the reality of the high-conflict personality, and the ultimate blueprint for rebuilding a life that is not defined by what you lost, but by who you became in the process. We will look at the final data points on life after the decree and the emergence of the new American man. The elegant exit is not about a lack of pain. It is about the preservation of dignity through the strategic application of sociological principles. In 2026, the concept of the scorched earth divorce is increasingly viewed by sociological researchers as a losing proposition for all involved, specifically for men whose long-term health and wealth are tied to the speed of the resolution. To understand the elegant exit, we must look at the transition from adversarial litigation to interest-based negotiation. Imagine a man named Alexander, a marketing director in Seattle. Alexander has realized that his marriage is ending. Instead of waiting for a served petition at his office, he chooses the path of collaborative divorce. This is a specific legal and sociological framework where both parties and their attorneys sign a contract agreeing to settle out of court. If the process fails and they go to trial, the attorneys must resign. This creates a powerful incentive for everyone to stay at the table. The first step in the elegant exit is the decoupling of emotion from equity. Sociologically, men often struggle here because they view the division of assets as a judgment on their worth. Alexander, however, treats the dissolution like the closing of a business branch. He understands that every hour spent arguing over a $5,000 dining table costs him $1,000 in legal fees and $10,000 in lost emotional focus. Historical trends in 2026 show that men who adopt a business mindset early in the process retain approximately 30% more of their liquid assets compared to those who engage in high-conflict litigation. This is the math of the rational actor. By removing the ego from the spreadsheet, Alexander secures a future that is funded rather than fractured. We must also analyze the sociology of the high-conflict personality, or HCP. In many cases, an elegant exit is only possible if one party refuses to escalate. If Alexander's spouse is an HCP, his strategy must shift to parallel parenting and the BIF method: brief, informative, friendly, and firm communication. This is a sociological shield. By refusing to engage in the emotional volleys, Alexander effectively starves the conflict of its oxygen. Step by step, he moves all communication to written, monitored platforms. He stops explaining his motives and starts stating his boundaries. Case studies from 2025 suggest that when one parent consistently maintains a low-conflict profile, the court eventually identifies the other parent as the primary source of instability. This is the long game of character preservation. The year 2026 has seen the rise of the post-divorce personal brand. For the new American man, the end of a marriage is the beginning of a total lifestyle redesign. This involves a concept sociologists call self-sovereignty. Alexander doesn't just find a new apartment, he builds a new ecosystem. He invests in a social circle that is not shared with his ex-wife. He joins specialized communities, perhaps a high-performance athletic club or a professional mastermind group, where he is known only as Alexander the professional, not Alexander the divorcee. This creates a clean sociological break. By building a world where his past does not dictate his present, he accelerates his psychological recovery. Let's look at the case study of the financial phoenix. Many men fear that a divorce at 45 or 50 means they will never retire. However, the data for 2026 suggests a different potential outcome. Without the financial drain of a mismatched partnership or the secondary costs of a high burn rate household, many divorced men experience a surge in their net savings rate within 3 years of the decree. Alexander simplifies his life. He moves to a high-efficiency urban dwelling, automates his investments, and focuses on his peak earning years without domestic distraction. This is the sociology of minimalism. By reducing his overhead and his stress, he often finds that his productivity at work increases, leading to promotions that offset the assets lost in the settlement. Furthermore, we must address the emergence of the new American man in the context of fatherhood. The elegant exit involves moving from a role of authoritarian provider to one of emotional mentor. In 2026, the data shows that children of divorce fare best when they have a father who is consistently present, even if that presence is in a separate household. Alexander focuses on quality of interaction over quantity of time. He creates a home environment that is stable, predictable, and distinct. He does not speak ill of the mother, not because he is a saint, but because he understands the sociological principle of triangulation. If he forces the child to choose, the child will eventually resent both parents. By remaining a neutral, supportive pillar, Alexander ensures his long-term influence in his children's lives. Step by step, the final phase of the masterclass is the integration of the lesson. The new American man does not view his divorce as a failure, but as a graduation from a social contract that was no longer serving its purpose. He analyzes the historical trends of his own behavior, why he chose that partner, what red flags he ignored, and how he contributed to the dynamic. This is radical accountability. Sociological research indicates that men who take full responsibility for their part in the dissolution, without falling into self-loathing, have a nearly 70% lower chance of repeating the same mistakes in future relationships. They become more discerning, more grounded, and more attractive to high-value partners in the 2026 dating market. The sociology of the future suggests that the traditional model of the nuclear family is being replaced by a more fluid, network-based structure. Alexander embraces this. He builds a tribe of mentors, peers, and friends that provide the emotional safety net, once provided solely by a spouse. This diversification of his social portfolio makes him more resilient. If one relationship fails, his entire world does not collapse. This is the ultimate defensive strategy for the modern man. He is no longer a monoculture. He is a diverse ecosystem of interests, responsibilities, and connections. As we conclude this 10-part deep dive, the final data points are clear. Divorce in the modern United States is a high-risk, high-cost sociological event, but it is not an end. It is a transition. The men who survive and thrive in 2026 are those who see the system for what it is, protect their assets with precision, guard their mental health with ferocity, and rebuild their identities with intention. You are now equipped with the sociological roadmap to navigate the most difficult terrain of a man's life. You understand the audit, the custody trap, the psychological siege, and the path to the second act. But understanding the map is not the same as walking the path. The reality of the modern U.S. landscape is constantly shifting as new laws are passed and new cultural norms emerge. What does the horizon look like for the next decade? How will the rise of decentralized finance and artificial intelligence continue to reshape the divorce industry? While this masterclass has covered the mechanics of the present, the evolution of the American domestic contract is far from over. The journey of the new American man is just beginning, and the choices you make in the shadow of the courtroom today will echo for the next 30 years. Your masterclass concludes here, but your application of this data starts now.